Hey, everybody, and welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis, and tonight we're going to be talking about dev containers and code spaces. But before we get into that, let me welcome in my partner in crime and newly minted PowerShell MVP. Welcome. Hey, Phil, how's it going?
How you doing? Welcome. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to participate more fully in the PowerShell community. So this is going to be fun.
So for longtime watchers of our user group, we now have two MVPs running the group, so you guys will have to be able to handle two of us. Um, But congratulations, Phil. You've done a
Thank you.
lot of great work for the community. It's certainly great to see you get the recognition.
Thank you.
So, Phil, I got a question for you.
hmm
Um, we're talking about open source tonight. How do you figure out the right tools to use when you're doing open source stuff?
I know what the answer is, but I'm trying to lead into where you're going with that. I guess the idea is, somebody says, hey, dev containers and all of that stuff. Really, I think, I was super excited to get our, speaker who's going to come on, and I wanted to bring him on because I saw him do a similar talk, and it's really expanded my usage of development overall. And so that's why I think there's a great value in it. And so this should be good. And so I want to welcome Joe. How you doing, Joe?
Joe Hughes, how are you, buddy?
Heyo, what's up, y'all?
Hey,
How you doing?
He's doing
so
great with his screens. Love it.
Joe's got
Love it.
quite the collection of stuff behind him. We were talking about that right before we kicked on the recording here. Joe, it's nice to have you tonight. How you doing?
Doing good, y'all. Thanks for having me. I always
Yeah, man,
enjoy
it's a good.
doing presentations for other groups. It's always fun.
Yeah, it's going to be a good time. All right, so tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about tonight.
So we'll jump into it with some slides and then back and forth with some demo and code and everything. But essentially, this is just around dev containers, right? So the idea with this is getting the things that you need to manage your code actually in the environment itself. So we're going to dig into dev containers. We're going to dig into code spaces. I even have a mention at the very end for polyglot notebooks. If we have a couple minutes to cover that, that's always a nice CYA for your code and for previous runs of stuff that you have as well. But really, this is all just about making it easy for you to keep up with the environment that you need to work with your code, as well as sharing that with other people. So we'll jump kind of straight into it. Let's get the share up.
Awesome. Just speaking from experience, you write a module, you do some code, you put something out there, and you're like, it's great. People are going to help me, and I'm going to do something. And then someone asks to do something with you, and they're using different tools and all this different stuff, and you realize,
Yeah.
wow, it's not as easy as I thought. And so this is a really great topic. I'm really interested to see what you have to share and recommendations. And so we'll hand it over to you, but have at it. This would be great.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, honestly, I got into some of this myself with just feeling frustrated with trying to keep things up to date on my personal laptop, my personal desktop, my work machine, keeping environments up when I would work on work projects in multiple places or personal projects that I would occasionally try and do all over the place. And yeah, just keeping environments up and running and keeping all your modules in place and keeping all your code clean gets rough, especially if you start doing things with Python and having to deal with like virtual environments or doing anything with like Node. I don't code anything in Node, but I use tons of tools that are all Node.js stuff. And for the life of me, I cannot keep up with the versions and everything like that. So having a way to keep this within your code, and anybody that's moving along the DevOps path and really trying to get into doing more stuff with CI/CD or automated testing of your code, it's absolutely awesome when you can package everything together and make sure that the environment that you are using to code everything is not dependent on what's on your laptop or other dependencies or getting things mixed in that would not be there when you try and do a clean provisioning of your environment in something like Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into it. So for those of y'all that don't know me, howdy, I'm Joe Hughes. I'm here because I'm a user group leader. I just love to get people engaged and learning. Um, you can find me online. I'm still on Twitter and other various social platforms that all seem to be going quieter and quieter every day, but I'm at J Hughes. I don't ever actually blog, but the content that I do have up there is on fullstackgeek.net. I was trying to get a blog together for some of this content to have it ready for right after the session itself, but I didn't quite get to that. Work keeps getting in the way for random reasons. So I will get that stuff put together with all the code that's here tonight and get this shared out afterwards. But a little bit more about who I am and why I'm here. Again, I'm a solutions architect at Pure Storage, but I'm also a co-leader for the Denver PowerShell and VMware user groups. I love working for my company that allows us to legitimately put a decent amount of hours into working on community events and doing a lot of evangelism in the community and helping other people. So that's a great thing to have. I am a serial collector of communities. Became an international speaker a couple years ago when I got invited to a couple of overseas conferences, which was great. I'm easy to spot in the crowd with a colored hat, a big grin, and a loud howdy y'all. I have little, or in some instances, or depending on how late at night and how many drinks at the bar has been, no shame, and try to share all my learnings with others. Right? Anything that we can do to help somebody understand something, or just make it a little bit easier for somebody else to get started, or see what opportunities there are to play with new technology and new projects, is always a cool thing, right? Uh, I always take the chance to pitch to user groups, right? I want every individual to push themselves, learn more, and don't fear sharing. And it's absolutely about sharing your knowledge. Your perspective is important. I may explain something in a different way than you might. I might say something 1,000 times and somebody does not get it. You say it once in a different fashion, using different words, use a different, analogy or something, and it comes across. So sharing what you know and your experience and your background is always important for people to understand how you got to where you are. And then I want people to teach whatever they can, right? A lot of this methodology comes from Don Jones and the Be the Master, which turned into, I think it was, I forget what the title of the new book is. Maybe Drive Your Tech Career. It got retitled when he took it over to Manning, but essentially this is around the Own Your Tech Career. Thank you, Josh. It's really around the methodology that exists with trades, right? So it's apprentice, journeyman, master, and it's about teaching things to people that come behind you. A lot of this is the same stuff that we kind of understand about open source. You want people to be able to learn from the things that you know and the things that you've done before, and pretty much everything is better for folks when we share. Obviously, there's some things that you can if it's proprietary to your company or things like that, but uh, this does not have to be limited to technology as well, right? If you can understand mechanical things, if you can teach somebody how to change a tire, if you can teach somebody how to do some basic cooking skills and things like that, anything that is real world knowledge that you can share with somebody else is always valuable and it's always worth teaching to other people. It does not have to be technology. And then the last point to drive home, job versus career, right? Your job belongs to your employer, but your career belongs to you. So you need to be in the driver's seat and you need to do the things that are important for you. Uh, Malicious or not, accident or not, or, market conditions or whatever else it is, or making sure that the dollars go to the investors. You might not be at your current job tomorrow. So be responsible for your own career and make sure that you have options in case that happens, right? Whether it's your choice or theirs. And then because I lost a bet with a buddy of mine who's in marketing, he tells me I never do enough work to brand myself. All the other things that I do, I'm a VMUG leader for the VMware user group. I'm a Microsoft MVP, just hit my second year now for PowerShell and got in for Azure Containers as well. VMware vExpert, VM Vanguard, Tanzu Vanguard, a Cisco champion, and I still help host the vBrown Bag podcasts on Wednesday nights. But honestly, I took a lot of the skills that I have in my career and just try and again share this basic learning and my experiences and all the things that I've done wrong with other people, because I don't want this to scare anybody. Even I will screw this stuff up, right? My own demos will go sideways. I will forget to set something up or just not copy my code correctly or fat finger things. In the end of this, we will all survive, right? Most of this stuff that we do in demos and in sharing with other people is not life or death. So that's it. No, Judd, I'm not trying to flex on anybody. Again, I lost a bet, so I legitimately have to be the guy who has to put up all the badges for, I think, another 2 months now until I'm off the hook on that thing. But really, with all of this, all the things that I've done in my career, the most awesome part for me is I've actually been able to take a lot of these skills and a lot of the practice and a lot of the awkwardness that I got over with learning to present and talk to other people in a lot of different areas, and rolled this into being the chief technology officer and the program sponsor for our mental health group for Dads of Castle Rock, which is our local community outreach group that got spun up by our dads. The group's been in place for about 5 years now. At the end of June, we actually have had our nonprofit that will hit 5 years in November, and we've brought in and paid out about $1 million in charitable donations for a lot of things that have happened in the area. So I look back at my career and I think a lot of the stupid things that I did, or a lot of the things that I was not super happy about at the time, built a lot of skills and got me to a place where I could take a lot of these things that I do in pre-sales or in technology, or just having to talk to other individuals in all sorts of different scenarios and all sorts of different backgrounds. And I'm able to turn that into something that's actually applicable, real world, and has real benefits for my community and for all of our kids and stuff like that. So think about these other skills that you have and where else you can apply them. That's not just at your job at the command line or inside of VS Code, right? Take the stuff out in the real world. So that's my pitch. On to the actual prezo. What are we here to talk about, right? So dev containers and code spaces. Really, kind of like we mentioned, a lot of this is about having fast, consistent environments. It's having clean environments that are also isolated to your code. A lot of these things are flexible. They integrate with lots of other tools. It allows you a lot of times to focus strictly on your code and not the configuration that you have of the machine that's running it. You're not having to try and match environments from a laptop to a desktop, from a work machine to a personal machine, and things like that. And if you really want to get advanced in it and move more on the DevOps path, you even have the capabilities of having CI/CD builds to do pre-builds of your container environment, so you can have everything packaged. Um, we'll get into it when we actually look at the code, but you have the capabilities with dev containers that you can build everything on the fly and basically have everything get built at provisioning time. Or if you want, you can build these images and just tag these and keep these in a Docker repo yourself. So much easier to basically just download and spin them up rather than actually trying to run everything. Sure, nothing important is actually going on in the chat. All right, cool. Good. So taking a step back and talking about how we got here, right? VMs versus containers. A lot of us have had to keep up environments, right, where you're dealing with infrastructure, you're dealing with hypervisors. Within an individual virtual machine, you've got a guest operating system, you've got binaries and libraries, you've got an app that gets installed on top of that, and you've got to do this multiple times to keep up an environment. I know in the past, less so for code modules and things like this, but with having installations, with having actual executables that needed to be on systems, I remember specifically having to have, I think, 4 different machines back in the Windows XP and Windows 7 days that ran specific versions of Java, because I had to go open up Java clients for networking components, for storage, for other tools that we had inside of the environment, for physical robotics hardware and things like that. That absolutely sucked, right? As we get more into the space where a lot of us are operating just more in code than anything else, we can start moving over to dealing with things in containers. So we're going to have that same infrastructure, right? Whether that's your network infrastructure, your compute, your storage, you're going to have an operating system that lives inside of any of that environment. And then you're going to have a layer for just the container runtime engine, right? For what we're using here in these demos, it's going to be just Docker. But then for what you're trying to manage for your code, you can have just your binaries and libraries and any applications or any things that you have inside of this, as well as your code that lives inside of this workspace. So it makes it a lot easier to manage and share these things that are not dependent on having a matching infrastructure for full-blown applications, or having to have entire virtual machines that are built to have either an individual app or every application that you have inside of a stack that's kind of all put together that you've got to deal with. Again, a little bit smaller scale as we're doing just code for dev containers, but all we need for what we're going to do here inside of this session is VS Code, Docker, right? And that's whether it's Windows, Mac, or Linux, just a standard Docker install for Docker desktop, or making sure that the runtime's on there. And then VS Code with the dev containers extension. That's all we have that we're using for this environment itself. For what a dev container actually is, the majority of these that you're going to see are just going to live inside of your repository. It's going to be a .dev container folder and then a dev container.json file. So if you're defining things within this dev container JSON file, you may define it from an image and just build on the fly. So it's going to be just that JSON file. Or if you're going to build from a Docker file because you have custom builds or you want to put additional things inside of there that are not included in one of these base images, and it's just easier to build from the Docker file itself, then you're going to have that dev container JSON file as well as a Docker file and just refer to that as your base build. There are plenty of templates that are available for where you can start with dev containers. There are also additional features that you can inject into the environment. This is where you would put in, your PowerShell, your Python. You can put things like Ansible or Terraform inside of this environment, all just with features that are basically already built, that are already open source, and you can just consume them to be inside of your dev container. You also have the capability of injecting standard VS Code options. So if you want to include specific editor rules, if you want to set what your integrated terminal is going to be inside of this environment, if you want to inject specific extensions that are actually going to be inside of this environment itself, you can put all of those inside of this dev container JSON. And really, in the end, what this allows us to do is just make it so that your local OS is going to have VS Code running. You can have a set of extensions that run locally on your box and all of your source code. But when you spin up this dev container, it's actually going to provision the dev container off of whatever image you have defined or whatever you have built in your Docker file. And it's basically going to start up the VS Code server. It's going to have separate extensions that can be injected into the workspace itself. You're going to get ports exposed. Your source code gets mapped in as a volume mount. And this container has its own file system, its own processes for the terminals, any of the applications, if you want to do debugging and all sorts of things inside of this. Your dev container can basically have legitimately, tons more stuff that you're going to have inside of the dev container to work on your code and to do debugging than you would end up having inside of what either an end user is going to use to just run your code, or what you would even use inside of CI/CD to just make sure that it builds and compiles and passes all of your automated testing and everything. So that's what we've got for dev containers. At this point, we will go ahead and flip over to the demos. Everyone pray to the demo gods, because the strongest steel is always forged by the hottest dumpster fire. So let's get out of this real quick. Let's see. Hopefully Teams will let me flip the screen with everything. All right. So quick overview for a lot of the components we're going to kind of look at in dev containers. We'll just make it easy and we'll fall to the documentation itself. So everything you want to find out about dev containers, for the most part, you're going to find at containers.dev, right? Microsoft put together this fantastic site to just have everything kind of all in one place to run everything. So within this, you're going to have an overview that shows you just kind of how everything looks, how you can build and test, where you're going to find even the components for running things in a CI pipeline if you want, as well as all the reference documentation from this main overview page here. To really dig into it, right, you've got the full spec for how all of the container files work, right, where they get placed. Typically, everything's going to be in a .dev container / dev container.json file, right? You can put it in different places, but this is logically where you're going to find it in most repos that you're going to look at for examples and things like this. You've got a bunch of additional logic for what you can run inside of these environments, right? You can, similar to a Docker build for a container, you can run things that are when it's created, when content is updated, after creation, after it's actually started, after the volume mount has attached, as well as specific things that you can inject for the remote environment, for the container environment itself, port forwarding, what it's going to do when you shut these things down, a lot of specifications for what you want here. And then to figure out how to actually build all of this stuff, there's a fantastic JSON reference file that shows you how to just build all of these components. One second. Got my dog trying to chew things up in my office. Okay. So as far as what additional tools you can actually run this inside of, for 99% of us, we're just going to run it inside of VS Code. But if anybody also uses Visual Studio or IntelliJ, You have the capability of just leveraging dev containers. So whether it's you or other people on your team or other people that are going to contribute to your tools, if they use a different development environment, their tools will automatically consume dev containers, and you don't have to change anything for this. There is also the capability of using the extensions in VS Code to do a lot of this via the GUI, or to build dev containers via CLI and actually spin them up. There's additional other tooling. Most people will not use things like this unless you're, in a heavy dev environment. But we'll cover a lot of this and how it actually looks. And again, features, super powerful and make it really easy to actually automatically include additional things inside of your dev containers by basically just saying, I want this feature to be put in here. And you can specify specific versions of things like this. If you want Git, if you want PowerShell, if you want Python, some of these components may already be built into the base images based on whatever they put into Linux, or based on how those image builds were created. But if you want to make sure that these components get added, you can put them in as just features, right? If you want to test a site that you're doing that's running Hugo, right, which I know I use for my blog for just a static site generator, you can actually put a dev container with the Hugo feature inside of your code. So the same code that you run on GitHub for your website itself, you can actually have the container inside of there. Awesome thing that spans into Codespaces, where you're actually using live editing environments from any browser that we will get to as well. So just a quick overview as far as like what the features themselves will do. For this instance of, say, Python, right, you're going to tell it, I want this feature of Python, and then you can specify the version if you want additional tools to be installed in there. If you want to name out a whole list of tools beyond the default ones that are in there, you can specify this stuff, and then you can install Jupyter if you want. You can do optimization to do like recompiling and performance compilations of Python and things like that. I believe I had like Azure CLI is a feature that's inside of here. So if you want to make sure that you have Azure CLI installed on a box to be able to test things, and if you want to be able to consume Bicep but not have to have that on your laptop and keep that up to date, things like this are capable for you to just subscribe to inside of your environment. Same thing for, say, GitHub CLI or for PowerShell, right? The PowerShell feature is pretty easy. You basically just give it a list of what version you want to have in here, and then what modules you want to have installed. My environment, I've not actually updated for this new spec for doing the modules, so I still do a bunch of my modules via run commands inside of a Docker build if I'm doing that, and we'll go over that. But if you want to keep everything contained and nice and easy inside of your JSON files and have all of this built in without anybody having to do additional scripting or having to build Docker images on the fly, you can stuff all of this inside of your feature dependencies inside of that main JSON file. So with that, let's just go ahead and get straight over to the code. So again, quick overview of the dev containers CLI option, right? Once you're inside of a directory, you can just tell it, I want to run a dev container build or a dev container up, and just give it a path. So without doing this inside of VS Code, if you're just doing this inside of, say, WSL, for your images to run faster, you can run, 99% of this stuff command line with just having your JSON files pre-built.
Could
But
you
for what a
zoom your
build,
could you
yeah, sure.
zoom your window just a bit, please? Thanks.
How's that?
A little bit more.
And we got a question from Stephen Judd. Hey, Stephen.
Thanks,
Hey,
Mike.
Steven.
So, Joe, the dev container command that you ran in order to, I'm assuming it was above this because I didn't see where that got executed. So, is that an executable that you download and get from somewhere? Where does dev container come from?
So the dev container CLI is a node package, right? So I actually went through this morning and did the install of NVM node version manager, and actually let it install Node.js on my box. So there's I'm trying to remember. I think it was on the VS Code site, or it's at least on Microsoft Learn, that there's a quick overview of how to install Node on your box. Once node exists here, you just do an npm install for @devcontainers/CLI. And once this is here, then you can just run, and this will actually put a dev container CMD file or a PowerShell script on your box to run this, and then you get the options of working with the dev containers, right?
How do you determine whether or not you want to run the CMD command or the PowerShell script?
You don't necessarily actually have to specify it. Like on this one, I'm just running dev container, so you can run devcontainer.cmd. Let me change directories to one of my repos real quick. Dev containers. Let's do.
So I think one of the things also is that if you're using VS Code and you can simply add that extension and it will kind of handle a bunch of that stuff for you. It will add a bunch of stuff. If you do it like he's doing it in the console, and so that is outside and kind of doing. But if I use all of this and just inside of a VS Code, and VS Code kind of like the GUI just helps me out. So just wanted to offer that.
So in this, you could specify if you wanted to the devcontainer.cmd build, and then I'm just giving it like the workstation folder is just the current directory that I'm in, and it'll start going and building my image, right? You can also run the PowerShell script itself. 99% of the time, I just run it as dev container because it's already put it on my path to know what executable to run, and I'm typically either just running dev container build for this workspace folder. Because a lot of times I'm trying to work on multiple dev containers all at once just to make sure that they work properly when I'm doing updates. So I'll go fire off a couple of different terminal sessions to build out of different folders all at once rather than doing them every time in VS Code. Because when we get to it in a second, you see when we do it in VS Code and rebuild, it'll like relaunch your window and you only can connect to one dev container per VS Code window, which makes it a bit of a pain for dealing with multiples at the same time.
So what is that use case for using multiple and having like, so you have a dev container in each folder and then running multiple dev containers? Is that all within different sessions?
Most of what I use it for is here. Let me just pull my directory up here and then show it. So say in this instance, I've got a couple of dev containers that are built that use the Debian base image, a couple that use Ubuntu that have just PowerShell installed on top of some of those, and then I use the default image. The default Linux image is actually what gets built if you're going to use Codespaces on GitHub. So if I'm trying to specify, a lot of this is when I'm trying to do tests on our internal PowerShell modules or the modules that we have that even consume our REST APIs. And when I go do a version change on these things, I want to make sure that the module itself is actually built in such a way that like the PowerShell module will go build on all of these boxes against all these different Linux images, or especially if I'm wanting somebody on our development team or a customer to be able to consume the PowerShell code in a code space, I'll specifically build it on that default Linux image rather than specifying like Ubuntu or Debian. But it's really just to make sure that we really have like cross compatibility with everything. And for me, a lot of the times it's just making sure that all the packages and all the appropriate versions even install together properly and can like connect to a single endpoint, run essentially a pester test and just give me back like known results to make sure that everything functioned correctly when I do a version change on a PowerShell module or something like that.
So is it good to say at this point, for those who are still kind of not familiar with even dev containers and the use cases we're thing, is that this is where you're saying is that, hey, you have 7 environments right there. And so each environment is unique to its own. And so you create this dev container, and this container houses the like the working set of, hey, any of the modules, the system, that this can be a known quantity as far as what that looks like. So as you just said, is if you want to then mirror what is in Codespaces, or for people who are just developing for other things, is like, hey, I'm going to put this up and I want to say I certify that this lives within this space and is a known quantity. Or I'm going to develop my module and I'm going to put it in there and say, here's all the dependencies, but I know that this is what's going to happen. I think we're going to come into that too a little bit.
Yep.
Is that, hey, here's the dependencies that go along with it. Here's the extra stuff that comes along that I assume you already have. And so, like, yeah, you're putting there,
Right.
that you're going to say that this is that Python and that kind of. So if you want to be able to say this is exactly what it's going to be, and this is what I can assert at that point, but by doing it in a dev container, that's really the magic word at this point, is that I can run my world in this container, and I still have my other world outside, but I can jump into this little container and live and control my world.
Right. Absolutely. So in this instance, say this is, my Ubuntu image that has nothing other than basically just Python and PowerShell installed on it. Versus this next image that I have over here is the same exact thing, just does not have Python installed. But if I wanted, I could put additional features inside of each of these for if I want to have a clean PowerShell environment that automatically gets extensions, that automatically gets a bunch of modules and specifies a specific version of PowerShell, that can be different on a box or on a dev container that's going to have PowerShell combined with Python, right? Or especially in instances where I'm using Python specifically for something like Ansible, or if I'm doing an environment where I'm working on some things in PowerShell and I've got some Terraform code inside of there, I can have each of these environments set up with all of the packages that I want to have contained in here. And I can set the versions of each of these for what my kind of specific use case is. So if I want to make sure that my PowerShell and Terraform stuff works on a new version of Terraform or a new version of my code and a new version of Terraform, I can do that inside of that single dev container environment without messing with every other environment that I have, right? So you can build as few or as many of these as you want. The fewer of these that you build with the more features inside of them, you're getting into basically just keeping, an entire virtual environment on your system, right? So it really just comes down to what sorts of things do you want to have all together, or what becomes convenient for you, really, as far as is it worth having PowerShell and Azure CLI together, right? Are you going to do PowerShell with Azure Functions together? And again, not only would this be on your individual machine, but anybody else that downloads your code repository to try and work against these code bases themselves, or anybody that's trying to use this same dev container that will provision a code space inside of GitHub when somebody uses it, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
think
you have the capabilities of tweaking, whatever it is you want, essentially.
Yeah, and I think you'll get to it later on, and you can kind of see there. That's where I was getting to. If you scroll down a little bit, there's that customization. You can customize what's going to be in this code space, right? And so, hey, I want it to automatically have these PowerShell modules, or even these. I want to run some script when it creates this container, so that this is already pre-staged for me. I want to import some variables. I want to import some, go check out some stuff, and so it only lives within this container itself. And so that becomes also the magic, right?
It does. And again, it's customizable for how much you want inside of this. One of the first places that I really started working with dev containers, that I'll show in a second, was actually with the modern IT automation book, because Michael down in New Zealand, who put this thing together, him and I forget the guy's name, I think it was Jay Freeman on the repo, had put together a fantastic dev container that, for those of us that were doing authoring of the book, that was all in Markdown and everything, you did not have to go configure your box to go do this. You could spin up the repository, or clone the repository, spin up the dev container, and it had all of the rules that it needed inside of there for how the editor should look, how the rulers should be on the screen, so that everyone that was editing the book to be in a specific format so that it could actually go to physical print as well as being exported out as a PDF. All of that formatting was 100% correct for everybody and was exactly the same, with zero effort from the actual editors to go do that configuration themselves, because they would just build everything into the dev container itself, and then everybody can just consume and not have to worry about the configuration for their environment or for a specific workspace folder on their system having to be set rather than just cloning a GitHub repo and going straight to work. So yeah, quick overview on just a lot of the different features and functionality you can have inside of here. You may even just want to have very similar to profiles themselves inside of VS Code. Like I finally had to clean up because on my default profile, I think I still have it in my default profile. Nope, I think I actually cloned everything. Yeah, my cleanup where I was running everything in a single profile in VS Code was actually up to like 120 some odd extensions at one point, and I was like, I'm really never running Ansible and Terraform and Hugo code and PowerShell and API functionality and all of this at the same time. So once I had finally seen that there was the capability of running different profiles inside of VS Code, where say for this DevContainers environment, it runs just the extension for WSL and DevContainers and nothing else inside of here. But I flip to another profile for PowerShell and it auto loads my 35 odd extensions that I have inside of there or whatever it is. You can do this same exact thing and extend this to other people with DevContainers because you can define your base build of your environment, the way that this configuration is entirely set up, as well as extensions or even PowerShell modules that automatically just get delivered to somebody else by nothing other than them just cloning your repo, right? So it's fantastically powerful. And that was the thing that really made DevContainers click for me the most, I think, was thinking of it in the same concept of switching between a profile in VS Code and having everything automatically reset. So let me close this one down. But essentially, when you do the build of all these containers, I just kind of want to show for anybody that has experience with Docker, right? You're gonna see basically this when you build your containers. It's just doing all the steps that you would see for either downloading and running or building a Docker image from a build file, depending on how you have your dev container set up. And typically these things can take a couple minutes. This one was not too bad for this rerun of a workstation environment because I had already built this image before. But on some of these others, it can take a significant amount of time to do the runs and do the installs of everything, right? This one, took basically about 2 minutes to build this dev container. The base image for that Ubuntu, or sorry, for the default Linux image, I will warn everybody, takes a while the first time, specifically because of the fact that you even just have to download that image, which is, gosh, the last I looked at it, like 11 or 13 gigs, somewhere inside of there, because that template or that base image has tons of stuff that's installed inside of it, right? It'll run things for C++, C#, for Node. It'll have Python stuff that's installed inside of there, a ton of other things, since that is the base build for GitHub Codespaces. So it has tons of additional things that are shoved inside of that versus having a Debian box or an Ubuntu box or like Alpine that just has only PowerShell added to it. Right. So your build's going to be different for some of these things depending on what it is that you actually have defined inside of these. And some of them are pretty quick. And especially when you do rebuilds of existing environments, it's really not bad at all. Okay, I'm going to warn everybody, you're probably about to go blind when I hit one of my demo ones. Here we go. So
Well, I think so. I just want to stop you there too. So for those who are still kind of following along, is this idea that it ultimately, as you kind of saw there, is it's just effectively building Docker containers, and so you can attach to these containers raw, but this is a way in which you can use other tooling to inject yourself and immediately mount into some of those containers and live within them. But effectively, it's just another container, and so you can put code into that container, and then it lives within that container. So it's like not like a VM, but it's a container. And this allows you to do that. And there is a JSON file, a build script to add the capability to build what that container looks like, and a bunch of other features that come along. But at its core, it's just a container, and so it's going to build just like everything else. So
yep. Yeah, so for an example of one that's actually building off of a Docker file, right? This is the linter that we had that was all put together for running the dev environment for doing editing on that modern IT automation book that came out a couple years ago. And so this thing was defined to have a couple of extensions that pop up in VS Code automatically. It defaults to the PowerShell shell for Linux. The post create command, it'll actually go run a PowerShell script that's inside of here to go set and like verify that the character limit that was set right, that it's running all the linting, that it's running the word count limits that we had to have set for everything for the actual publishing of the book. That's all defined via script and then via this environment. And then the Docker file itself just says like, go build from PowerShell Ubuntu 2004, add this stuff for Go, add this stuff for Git, add this stuff for Node, for Veil, for the Veil styles, for Markdown lint, for YAML lint, for Pester. This is a ton of stuff. If you have to try and document it for people, even people that are volunteering to edit this book, where a lot of this was done by people that were very active in the community and that were decently PowerShell savvy. Trying to explain Node and Veil and linting and Markdown and all the Python and YAML stuff that had to be inside of here to get this consistent end product for everybody would have been super painful. Instead, since this exists in this Docker file and this devcontainer.json, inside of VS Code, we can actually just, because we have dev containers inside of here, we can tell it what we want to do is just go reopen in container, right? If I even, as an example, just close out VS Code and open it up, the first thing it's going to tell me is that it knows that there is a devcontainer.json file in here, and it asks me, do you just want to reopen this in container? So I can just hit reopen in container. This thing will start building. Let me get my zoom up so we can look at the log for building the container itself. Oops. I hit something when I was zooming in here. And it will show you the build for this. For all I know, this is going to bomb because of old versions of things, because this repo is like 2 years old. But even just VS Code with that single extension for dev containers, it knows about these files that live inside of here, and it will let you try and reopen this in container. Since it failed to build, it even gives me the option of just going in and doing the editing of this to try and do a rebuild. And it gives me the log file of what it was trying to do at the same time. So if I'm trying to diagnose based on the log file to go fix what is here in the dev container JSON or even in the Docker file, once this is done, I can just tell it basically go rebuild, right? So again, hit the command palette with Control Shift P or Command Shift P on a Mac and just go look for dev containers. And if I want to try and do this thing, I can tell it just rebuild and reopen in a container, right? It will shut everything down, try and open that remote container where it is now talking to Docker desktop. And if we look at the containers, based on what it was trying to do, nope, it already killed it. So I didn't flip over fast enough. But you see the integration from VS Code to this where you can basically see everything that's running inside of your environment and then have it all logged in through, oops, there we go, through Docker as well. So let me close this one and we'll flip to another demo itself.
Did anybody have any other questions? There's a couple of raised hands, and I just want to make sure that I thought we were answering in chains, but did you have any other questions? Don, James, you're good?
I've got a couple. Don, you can go first if you want.
Okay. So from my experience using dev containers, which is on a Mac M1 with the ARM processor, the first thing that I noticed is that I had to be very specific in the base image that I selected for dev container, or it would not work on an ARM machine. The other thing that I've noticed is that just because somebody builds a dev container that they expect you to be able to use, if they are not aware of the cross-platform constraints, it will not necessarily work on an ARM machine like a Mac. And
that is correct.
When I discovered this, one of the first things that I saw is that the PowerShell dev container feature was not working for an ARM machine because it didn't set the PWSH as executable, and it would not work. it was broken. And it was very frustrating trying to figure out, one, why it wasn't working, which I did eventually after looking through all kinds of logs. And of course, you have to find exactly the right log, or you will still be wondering what the hell's going on.
Right.
So that was really disappointing that not much in terms of cross-platform is encouraged or certainly not enforced. And people think that they're writing a dev container that other people can use, but that's not necessarily the case at all.
Yeah, so I mean that is going to be one of the things, right? So a strong consideration for dev containers is to consider writing these that people can just consume them in code spaces, because GitHub still gives everybody free, what I think 60 hours or something a month in code spaces. So uh, the dev container could still get provisioned as a code space, and basically it's entirely running up in GitHub. You're just consuming and writing the code via your web browser or through VS Code that's remotely connected up to GitHub to run that. Or just consider that people that are running it on other systems may be running on back and forth from x86 and 64-bit OSs to ARM processors. So there are going to be considerations that you're maybe going to have to make for that. So the other option you do have is having you can run a repository with multiple dev containers and multiple source directories for your code for this. There's a good video on YouTube that was put out by the cloud advocate. I'm totally blanking on her name. I know her tag name is GPS. But you can essentially run multiple dev containers inside of your same repository. Just they have different base folders for them, and you could build one that's valid for x86 architecture, and you could build one for ARM. Some of this is just the unfortunate reality of doing things cross-platform between operating systems and specific actual CPU architectures. There's potentially going to be things that don't work all the time, right? And if you assume that you're building it just for you, you might not do well by somebody else.
Right. And I was expecting, since this was built, this whole idea was the VS Code teams work for dev containers. And since VS Code itself does such a good job of cross-platform, I was expecting a similar experience in dev containers. And that's just not there yet. And I'm trying to help make it better, but which kind of leads to my second question is, when you report issues to an open source repository like dev containers features, how do you actually get someone to do something about it without becoming a pest?
That one's honestly a difficult one. I know I was having to go look at. I had a dev container that I had to go build on a new machine last week, and I could not get. At this point, I don't even remember for sure. I think it was actually Python that was failing, but I needed Python on the box to run Ansible. But I was trying to run Python at a specific version. I think it was like 3.11 or something, rather than OS default, or rather than latest, because I wanted to have it specified, because that was what existed in my existing container, and I didn't want to have to deal with possible changes in Python that break my code, because I didn't. It's not the most robust thing. I built it to do a handful of functions and was just trying to get that base functionality on another box. But doing a clean build of that same dev container on a new environment wouldn't work, because there were changes in the repository for the features, and compatibility between the base image and then what was there for the Python version was like broken. But since the code is actually basically what's in there for the feature, you have to put in an issue on the features repository, and some of those have not been updated in a while, right? It's really just dependent on how much somebody uses the thing, and whether you're a squeaky enough wheel, basically, that somebody goes and pays attention to it, unfortunately, or sometimes it's, if you can, see if it's worth your time to roll up your sleeves and at least try and do more investigation to add more details to the issue, or see if you can actually resolve it yourself and then contribute back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the in the case of the PowerShell feature not functioning properly, it's an easy enough workaround to change your post create command to actually do a chmod on the PWSH executable, at
Yep.
which point it works. So, I can get around it because I know how to do it, and it works fine for me, but geez, that doesn't help the next person down the line, does it?
Right. Yeah, and again, that's one of those things where whether you're the first person to hit it or you're just the first person to complain about it, sometimes being the early adopter or being the person that's trying things the most kind of sucks. But I would encourage you to at least, like, even if you don't go put in a fix on the repository or go file anything else for the issue, go blog about it. Go put out a tweet on how you fixed it if it's short enough for somebody to be able to consume, so others that are searching might be able to find what your fix was.
Right. That's a good point. Thanks.
Hey, Sean, I saw your hand up.
I muted Sean just because he was at a conference, but you
Cool.
can come back on. Hey, James, did you add something quickly, and then or we'll get going and we can come back to it.
I mean, I can still be patient. Like, it's cool. So go for it, Sean. Or I can be impatient and ask questions, whichever one.
Go for it, James.
Okay, so dude, you went fast. I was having a little trouble tracking through a couple of things, and I wanted to double check something. Do you know of a good way to just take the current branch and build a dev container based off of that? This is the question I was curious about 20 minutes ago. I did figure out an answer in those 20 minutes.
Current branch of just any
whatever
code repository?
project. Yeah.
I mean, so that's what we're going to do here, right? This is like, once everybody's seen a bunch of the bells and whistles on everything, like, here's just building a base dev container itself, right? So I don't even have code inside of here. Tell you what, let me go grab a repo real quick.
Sure. The quick trick that I did figure out, I was able to build a minimal dev container by creating a directory called dev.devcontainer, then creating a file called devcontainer.json, which only has two properties in it: the name, which doesn't seem to matter, and the Docker file. And the Docker file ended up being a relative path. I did // file, and that worked. That threw me through a loop a little bit. I'm not sure where yours was different. What was kind of cool about this, after Visual Studio Code got the right number of kicks to actually see it, it was able to bring up that minimal image and just, start installing extensions if I needed it. So I didn't have the PowerShell extension set up in that one. Open a PS1 file. It's like, hey, do you want to install the PowerShell extension here? Cool.
Yeah.
So that was handy. What I don't know how to do yet, and if you can pause for X seconds to show, it'd be great. It's how to expose some ports in that dev container.
Yeah. So let's do this. Let's do.
Sorry for the 1-2 question punch.
No, not at all, man. Let's just clone this here. Start with this one. Nope, already exists. Let's make another one. Okay. All right. So PS cones, I've got this for doing some stuff later, but we can start with it now. So let's just open up VS Code in this repo. So we have the repository up for PS cones, right? Got the README here. So this was just freshly cloned. Like I forked the repo earlier just to have my own copy of the thing rather than go download the current one. So if we did a build of this and I wanted to put this back up for an example, then I can just go push to my fork of it. But with this environment, let me flip to my profile for DevContainers. Okay. So again, all I've got in here is the DevContainers extension as well as the WSL extension, just because I was having to do troubleshooting on stuff earlier. So with this inside of here, you just open up the command palette, and we're going to do DevContainers add DevContainer configuration file. The first thing it's going to ask you is, do you want to save this in your user data folder or do you want to save this in your workspace, right? I want to pick workspace because I want this to go into source control. And then at this point, it's asking what is the container template that I want to build from, either by name or by ID. So you can scroll through here if you want to see a handful of just kind of the top level ones that they figured most people were going to use. I can just scroll down and hit PowerShell, right? So I want to add PowerShell. Then it asks me what features do I want to install inside of this thing. Just for grins, let's do GitHub CLI. Now let's do GitHub Actions Runner. Why not? Okay. So I add these inside of here. It will automatically create the folder and the JSON file for what I defined it as, right? So this PowerShell image is built off of Debian 11 on the long-term branch. It will automatically install common utilities. So it will put in ZSH. It changes the username to VS Code. It does not upgrade your packages. It does not include non-free packages. Then it's also adding in that single feature for GitHub Action Runner that I just picked via the drop-down menu. And then the customization, it will automatically set the shell to PWSH. It'll add the extension for PowerShell here. And this one includes in the spec the port that you want to forward for this. So if I wanted to forward 8081 to 8080, see, I'm trying to remember. I think this is where I'm terrible, and I don't remember off the top of my head. So this is why I fall back to the spec file. But forward ports is what you need inside of here, and it's this is your list of ports to make all of the container ports available locally to your system. I will pull up one of my other dev container repos that actually has the functional port forwarding list for this. But essentially, that's all you're doing, right? Is just doing port forwarding, not entirely dissimilar from what you're doing with Docker, especially defining it in like a Docker Compose file. But this here, let me get rid of the forward ports, just because if that doesn't work, I don't want it to bomb. But this should let me basically take this new dev container configuration that was put on this current branch of the code that I pulled down from GitHub, and then be able to just reprovision this inside of a dev container. So if I just go now to my command palette, I can type in dev containers again, and then the one that I'm looking for is just reopen in container, right? So what this should do here now is start reading configuration for it. Pull up the log on this one. And basically, this is showing me the build that it's doing for everything. It's pulling down the Docker file. It's actually running the installs for everything that's inside of here. So we can see this. And it'll show you basically every step of the, pretty similar to what you're going to see if you're doing a build of a Docker container, or if you're doing a Docker run, right, where it's going to download and do all the steps that are defined for it building this image locally.
So Joe, what version of PowerShell is it going to be using? Or do you have to only figure that out after it's done?
No, you can define that in the features. So the documentation on each feature is what will tell you what capabilities that it has and what it wants for this. But once this comes up, or once it just lets me re-edit this, then I can pull up and show you the spec that's in here. So in this instance, because what I used was actually the PowerShell image, you have to go to that PowerShell template itself to go see what it is. So let me pull it up to show what I'm talking about here. So I don't know, it's of course not even building, which is fun. So inside of this dev container definition that I have here, all I defined was the actual image, right? So PowerShell for LTS Ubuntu, LTS Debian 11. This is not going to tell me anything that's here the way that it would if I had PowerShell installed as a feature, because then it actually lets you define the PowerShell version itself. So let me flip back over to my other screen for the docs on this, because the Microsoft Container Registry will actually show us what it's got inside of here. There we go. Sorry, source repo. So for PowerShell Docker, and then inside of the releases, where is it? Man, I'm totally blanking on where. Sorry. Anyways, this one's going to be
by version.
Sorry, what was that folder again?
Go into the release folder, and then there's an image for each version. Go to the version of PowerShell. If you're looking for
right. The problem I had was that the image that I've got defined in the thing here is just for the PowerShell like LTS Debian 11. So trying to basically track down from the image what's the PowerShell version that's installed on it. That's what I'm
it'll be
failing at right now.
The latest LTS, which is 7.4.
Okay. Okay, cool. So then Debian 11. Okay, cool. So here's the actual Docker file for what's installed on this thing, so that's amusing. So even what it shows here is for the arguments on everything are actually 7.3 preview 8.
Yeah, and that gets replaced by the build that builds the Docker file for publishing.
Cool. So Sean, phenomenally smarter than me about how the actual build process for all of this works. Some of this gets really into the innards of PowerShell, of Docker, and like layering everything together for doing builds on all of this. This is also one of the heavy considerations for doing things like actually having your specification. Let me get back to my Debian base. So this one's probably my Ubuntu. Here, let me pull this up real quick to show. So like in this instance, I actually have my dev container specified to just be an Ubuntu image so that I can have PowerShell installed by itself. If I want to actually even just change this specification file being here inside of VS Code, it knows what to do with this. So I can just pull up the command palette for Command-Shift-P. I can do configure container features. And if I type in PowerShell and hit OK, it will, I don't want to do it via releases. I want to do the dev containers version. It'll ask me if I want to keep the defaults or if I want to configure the options. The defaults are going to be what is listed in the repository for the PowerShell feature within dev containers itself. If you want to specify, you can specify. So the two pre-built options that they give you inside of here are either none for a version, which doesn't actually work, or 7.1 or latest. So you can actually define 7.1 if you want inside of here. You can also do 7.2, 7.3, 7.4. And when I then go build this container, if I reopen it in a container, then it'll flip to version 7.1. If I come back into that devcontainer.json file and change it to 7.4 and then rebuild the container, then it will do a reinstall of PowerShell to that 7.4 version. So we'll get this thing up and then we'll pull up the PS version table on it just to look at it real quick. But yeah, some of the dev containers, if you're using a base image where PowerShell is already pre-baked into it via Docker builds, you're going to have to look at the documentation, or you're going to have to look at the build file, or you may have to just build the dev container to see what comes out the other side, especially if it's something where it's layered, in the build. So if I go to PWSH, no version, what? Man, this is fun. We've been using the pre-builts. Getting, yeah, so 717. And in this instance, PWSH is not actually working. It's dumping as soon as it's done. The usable version of libos. So cool. So let's do something real fun. So let's take a non-working version of this and let's go to 7.4 and then let's rebuild. Okay. So it's doing the same opening remote. We're connecting to the dev container. Go and let it build. So it had a spec in there for version 7.4 for PowerShell. Now it's grabbing the package. It's actually doing the full install from the .deb file. And once we get to the command line, then we can take a look at it again. So again, some of this really depends on how explicit you want to be in your environments. I would say if you need to have a specific version, then build everything from your own definition and layer in the features that allow you to specify a version, or do your own actual Docker builds from a Docker file and just stash your artifacts on your own repo.
So Joe, and one of the problems and maybe you have a good solution for finding out this information, but features can depend on other features, which means there's a dependency tree that's involved in features, and you will get features installed that you didn't actually explicitly request because of this dependency tree. And
that is an awesome point.
And it's like, until you actually build it and then you start going backwards and trying to reverse engineer it, you really don't know what you have unless you know of a tool that I haven't run across that will tell you all of this.
Let's see, I'm trying to remember because let's
I
see.
mean, you should be able to inspect the image and then follow it up. So like Docker inspect whatever generated container, and you should be able to continue to look at what it depended on and the layers before it and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's quite tedious.
It is,
Yeah,
but that's what for each loops are made for.
But yeah, this is also the thing of when containers are built by different people.
We wouldn't need to go to those details. I mean, really, the user that's coming up with the dev container isn't interested in all the layered details and how it works. They just want what they said they wanted. I mean, aren't we beyond, to having to go through a dump to figure out what's going on?
Well, I think the concern there is just that the dev container is there to say, here is exactly the environment that I would like to build from. And so me as a developer, and I'm going to put it into this dev container. Could be seen for you, but this is defined we're there. So, I don't think there's an expectation of I need to make this in a form that consumers are going to there. That's what my code is for, not all the dependencies inside the features at that point. And so I think at that point, it's just the containers themselves are, this is a baseline in which I'm using and what I can build from. And so if I can build from this, then you should build from the others. You should be able to build from the other. Now that there's no expectation that the beyond the features that are there, right? I can't warrant.
Well, some of it also is that like somebody may change the base image itself, right? Somebody might change the Docker build to actually go install additional things, or it might be using an old version of something like Python that doesn't uninstall cleanly, right? Or when you try and do an upgrade of something, or if a particular package, I was thinking Ansible did this, but I don't think it's Ansible. I think it was something else, where something else that's dependent on Python and pipx for installs actually tries to do its own installation of Python and then try and do its own install or fallback to upgrade of the pipx module. So if you're using either a base image that doesn't work with that, or a Python install feature that then conflicts with the feature of your second package that you're trying to put on here, right? You might have dependencies at all of those layers. Some of this is just going to come down to, it really depends on, I don't want to say how well these were built, but how flexible the builds of all of these things are to be layered together, and whether or not somebody actually tested all of these for like features to be running on different versions. Like honestly, even just on this one, just the reality of it being Linux and package management, this Ansible script for install only runs across Debian, Ubuntu, and Alpine, right? It's not going to run against CentOS. It's not going to run against RHEL builds if somebody were to put together a container for that, because that would be different builds for a different package management, and that's essentially double the logic that's got to be inside of here for how to do the portion of getting the correct packages on the box to then do the appropriate installs for everything that's there. Some of that's just the reality of not everybody's going to use everything, or honestly, the person who put together the feature for Ansible may not be somebody that's used to using a CentOS or a RHEL system, so that was just outside of their wheelhouse to build the thing. I don't have a real good answer for
That
even just
that
where to
does bring
find
up,
the
yeah,
breakpoints are, right?
that brings up a real good point about they aren't necessarily the same people doing that build of a feature as the team that built up an installer for the product itself.
Right.
Like and that is a little bit of a disconnect in terms of the dev container architecture.
Yeah,
right?
I mean that's fair. And again, I mean the worst that could happen in most of these things in my mind is if there's a breaking change that's made to the base build or the base image that these dev containers are built off of, because then everything downstream would be affected by that, right? Either
Right.
your features that you're installing through the dev container feature repo, or if you're doing your own shell scripts, if you're doing your own package installs inside of your own code, then that's going to be different, right? It's some of these things comes down to, you're going to have breaks at some point. You're going to have things that when an update happens somewhere in the line, a certain package or a certain feature install quits working, and at that point, if it needs to run 100% of the time, or it needs to be entirely within your realm to be able to control and to manage, then you might be doing your own builds from Dockerfile, so that at least when things break, you're catching it in your own release pipelines for those changes, which stinks, but that's the reality of
Right.
open source.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have
So
a strong preference of leaning on the latest Debian container or something over, picking a complex image and then layering features on top of it. I tend to prefer to have my own Docker file with a fairly base OS image, and then just install the CLI tools that I need, the features that I need within that Docker file.
yeah. So how about you keep on going there, Joe? You've been doing great.
Yeah, just I'm trying to look around real quick to see if I had one that's got a port forwarding real quick.
Well, I think we can just go. We can pull that back up after the meeting, and after we go from there, we can go to that.
Cool. All right. So yeah, another one that we've got just a pre-built image demo. Yeah. So similar thing where, again, that issue that I ran into with one of these environments where the Ansible feature itself would not install, right? For whatever the problem is that's in there. I forget if it actually was pipx or if it was actually the Ansible install, or one of its packages that it calls in when it does that full feature load itself. So that was kind of what I had to do in this instance, and that was why I left it in here for an example. Was I stripped out the feature for Ansible and just went straight back to essentially what I would do at a command line if I was doing an install of a new box, of doing apt update, apt install pipex, and then do a pipex install with all the dependencies for Ansible, because I got frustrated, basically spun out a new container that just had PowerShell and Python on it at this version, and said, okay, can I make this thing work interactively at the command line, and then can I shove that back in the code? That's part of the point on what I want to hit on this one, is that if you don't put these things in your code, even for something like James was mentioning, connecting to a dev container and putting installing an extension remotely, that will not be persistent. And if somebody else goes to build your dev container on a new box, or if somebody tries to spin this up as a code space, then that won't be there inside of that environment, right? Because you essentially like did an after the fact modification of your build, so it's not going to be idempotent for somebody else. So just other things to consider is that if you're not defining everything in either your Docker build or in your dev containers, even if it's a command to run after the fact to do your installs and things, then it won't exist there for somebody else, right? And sometimes things suck and you have to go back to the drawing board of how do I do this manually and still have it be inside of my code, until I can try this build with the other dev container configuration of a feature and have that work, right? So this gets me functional for building my dev container on another box, while I try and talk to and figure out what's actually going on inside of the feature itself to determine why it failed, so I can go open an issue for the thing. All right, so let's close that out. So this was a container that I just did a build on here. Let's check this one real quick, because nope, again, same thing. So this was, yeah, just definitions, right? To have an environment that's got Azure CLI using the latest, a specific older version of PowerShell and Python installed in it with Jupyter Labs, but it's not the one I was looking for ports. So, okay, back to this PS cones that I already had inside of my environment, which I was futzing with this thing all day long. So I still do not have this thing working 100%. But essentially, the point of this was to pull down PS cones and actually have a dev container that's got everything that it needs inside of it to be able to run PS cones interactively, right? So what I did with this is I actually went back to doing this via Docker file to just have an example of this. I even updated one of my old Docker configs, right, and bumped it up from 7.2.1 to 7.4, running on Ubuntu 20.04. It does an apt upgrade. It installs Git on here. It actually runs, some PowerShell commands. It goes and adds a new user on the Linux box that's here for VS Code. I was trying to run the shell switch here, could not get that functioning. And in the end, I switch into that VS Code user and then run install module for OhmyPosh, PS Readline, and Pester. These all work fine and install the modules on here. The thing I was not able to get working properly was actually getting it to add the working directory of this workstation cones to the PS module path, right? And I futzed around with this for like an hour, trying to figure out if I could run it as a shell script or if I could figure out what I needed to escape properly to get this to run in the Docker build. No success thus far, right? But in the end, I've still got at least a dev container build off of a Docker file. Then I have customizations in here to set the executable for PWSH, set the integrated shell, set the default version that I want it to run, and have the PowerShell extension put inside of this. So even though it doesn't run 100% and I have to run one command after the fact, what it gives me when I reopen this container is, again, 99% of the way that's there for this. When I open remote on this dev container, this will give me a box that has my PowerShell modules installed in here. Two problems. Okay, so it doesn't like something with my JSON, so that's fun. All right. So James, this one is doing port forwarding, but it's doing undefined. I was hoping that this would also show me in the build where it was doing that, but I do not have
Yeah.
port forwarding defined.
I so far had not had fun with it, but I did
Yeah.
find something kind of fun along the road. It's likes to actually forward port 80. Like if you set it up, which is nice-ish, but kind of unexpected compared to a pure Docker file.
Yeah, so there is a repository that I did have up here as like examples of things for people to go dig into to go look at. There's actually one that Chrissy Lemaire put up that I believe has port forwarding inside of it. So we'll pull that up when we get to it to check, unless you want to go look for it now.
That's okay. I actually am trying to type up notes for the user group I'll be doing next week on Docker.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry for the light look. I'll give a heavier one later.
So in this environment, when I jump inside of here, right, I'm in this workspaces PS cones directory. If I actually run my environment to get my user, nice, doesn't give me that back. Seen that in a while. Okay, so I am logged in as that VS Code user that I created and had it automatically defaulted flipped to, so I'm not using a root user inside of this container. And it did install OhmyPosh, it did install Pester, and it did install PS Readline for me. Again, mostly just because I'm not super proficient at Linux or doing the pass-through on the Docker commands, the Docker build for the run commands of what exactly needed to be escaped out in here. I'm sure it's something with either the $sign or one of the quotes that's in here. But if I still just go run this command itself, here, let me do PS module path real quick to show this first. So PS module path does not actually have my workspaces cones directory in it currently. And if I do, the command that we want to be able to get on here is show-karma. So if I go look for git command show, it currently has only show markdown, right? So if I do this single command to go add this to my PS module path, when I go look at my module path now, I now have workspaces cones, which is what I wanted it to do at build inside of here. And then when I do my git command for verb show, it gives me show karma, right? Which is the whole point of the PS cones itself, is you're learning Pester interactively, right? So it wants you to go run all of this and then run show-karma. So if I run show karma, it will could not be found, couldn't load formats to process. I think there is a recursion that's failing in here. PS cones format. Fun. Well, that didn't work.
I think the idea is interesting, though, just that, hey, you can pre-stage that. And so,
yeah, I mean,
the idea is that it's possible, and that this is kind of a good example to get you there.
Yeah. So at this point, it's where I was trying to jump over to Codespaces anyway. So we will just go ahead and flip over to that and dig into it. So getting into Codespaces, let me close some tabs here because I can't see with that sharing bar at the top. Templates. Yeah, there's tons of documentation on the site for doing images, Docker files, and other things. So if you want to take a look at some more advanced dev containers as well, there's a couple of really good repositories to go look at. The Azure PowerShell repo actually has the definition for a dev container and a Docker file that it runs for building all of this stuff. James, here's your, oh, okay. So I had quotes rather than just a comma for forward ports. So there you go. Right, but then this is basically doing a build for what needs to be contained to actually do development against the Azure PowerShell commandlets themselves, all contained within a dev container. One of the other ones that's interesting that I was surprised to figure out actually has a dev container for it is Home Assistant. Home Assistant actually has a definition for a dev container for everything that's inside of here, and theirs is pretty decent, right? It does port forwarding. It does forwarding of 2 different ports, and one is specified as like UDP only. This one's got specific extensions that get installed inside of here. They actually have settings that get passed into all of these downstream settings for VS Code inside of this dev container. So if you want an idea of how to actually pass VS Code settings into VS Code within a dev container for the end user, whether that's yourself or somebody else, here's a pretty good example of the structure for this. That's a more real world example than just looking at the JSON schema itself, right? And even setting like the default formatter for anything that's a Python file itself inside of here. So there's lots of good examples. Anybody that wants to get in more into dev containers, I highly recommend going and looking at this workshop library, because there are some awesome dev containers that most of these can be spun up as code spaces as well to actually go through and do workshops. So you can do a workshop to go learn a thing and then can dig into the dev container itself to actually see how some of these things were built to do all the self-contained code. Intro to Jupyter Notebooks is a fantastic one that does not take long to actually learn how to go build notebooks inside of VS Code. As well as there was a pretty good one that's in here for exploring REST APIs. So if you're not super proficient on REST APIs or even understanding how to use GitHub through the browser, there's some fantastic modules that are in here where you can pick up additional skills and then learn from them and their code on basically how to get a little bit further along with dev containers. But let's jump into bits on Codespaces. So things to highlight on Codespaces, there are some really cool quick start templates. Jupyter Notebook is a really good one to get into to start with. .NET is pretty easy for a lot of folks to follow along with, right? Any of us that are pretty decent at PowerShell can follow along with C# pretty easily. Or if you want to go learn some new stuff, if you want to go play around with like Flask for web applications and things like that, there's awesome templates to go build a code space, which is basically just a virtual machine running inside of the cloud that gives you access to all of this via a GitHub repo. For settings on Codespaces to know what things you can easily make accessible from your existing environment to considering switching over to Codespaces, or just make some of these things easier for the transition. You can automatically install dot files. You can actually have user secrets that get passed into your Codespaces. You can have even setting sync from VS Code to your Codespaces, and basically have this only push to specific trusted repos for all of your stuff. That makes it easier to start building there without having to immediately start duplicating and figuring out how to copy over all of your settings and all of your extensions. So things to just be aware of, that you can try and play with these things somewhat easily. So another one for taking a look at is
Joe, those workshops were where? Where did I missed that before.
I'll post. Yeah,
Okay.
let me grab the link and I'll put it in the chat real quick.
All right, thanks.
Yep. Flip back over real fast. And
speaking of links to put in chat, here's the next week's user group.
I put the link in the chat already, Joe.
Oh,
cool. Got it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Appreciate you, Steven.
I got you, bro.
And how bad is it that I have not seen you in like 4 or 5 months, and like not even seeing you on camera, I can just recognize the voice to know who that is. Like, it's not even just the sticker, dude. It's like 100% of you.
Some people wouldn't consider that bad, Joe.
He's got
that isn't bad. We've got a lot of people who have very distinctive voices in the community in multiple ways, and it's a wonderful thing.
Oh yeah,
he's got a face for radio. It's all good.
I do for sure. So I'm not gonna put that on anybody else.
I have a face for glitter stickers.
I thought you were going through a glitter sticker phase.
Oh, it's a phase, all right.
That's a long phase. So for this example, to just kind of understand like the basics on Codespaces, Pester has a dev container that's defined in its repository as well. So all I did inside of GitHub, I happen to be logged in, right? Instead of doing the local tab for cloning down your repo or opening it in GitHub desktop, I clicked over to Codespaces and just clicked create a Codespace on main, and that's what it's provisioning for me now, right? Is This thing will take a minute to spin up, but essentially this will take the definition of that container, that dev container, and spin it up as essentially a virtual machine for us, right? It's a cloud instance that's running inside of this environment. And if I go look at say, what is it, proc CPU info, I'm running on a 64 core AMD EPYC, right, inside of this environment, which is very obviously not my desktop that I'm running this thing from. But you get access to all of this just via GitHub, right? And again, there's, I want to say 60 hours a month that everybody gets of Codespaces. So if you want to do development, I've had to do this a handful of times where somebody has asked me to go look at something and all I had was like my iPad and didn't want to just be staring at code in a web browser without having, syntax highlighting or anything else or whatever. I will go look at a repository and spin up a code space from it just to make it an easier experience when I'm working on different devices. I very actively tell people all the time when I only happen to have my phone with me, though, because then I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I've got fat fingers and a small phone, so I can't go look at your full code repo and don't feel like doing it right now. So, I can at least restrict it to only times that I have, my full size tablet or laptop in front of me. But consuming a code space, if you already have a dev container defined inside of your repository, is as easy as just going to GitHub and saying, spin me up a code space. If I refresh the page, then it will actually show me where I've got a code space that's already running. So I had 2 that got spun up. You can either stop these at any time that you want, or you can just tell it to delete. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these just to not keep burning my hours, because I will totally forget to come back and remove them later on. And then let's go take a look at another example. Anybody wanting a bit more of an interactive follow through on this, Chrissy Lemaire put together a fantastically awesome full repo on doing Azure functions inside of either dev container in a local box or Codespace. I highly recommend anybody go take a look at this and go follow along with it. But for examples of some cool things you can do if you have dev containers and have all of this stuff built where you can spin it out as a code space, is actually this here. This is a tool that one of our guys at Pure put together that will actually basically build a Docker container and run all of our API specs to give you a Swagger interface for it without you actually having to have anything installed, right? So it's all just a Docker container. He doesn't even have a Docker file or a dev container definition that's here. But just because of the fact that I can spin this out in Codespace and I know that what's contained inside of that universal image, I can actually just go and open up this Codespace that's here. I grab my code for the Docker run. And I can even provision a Docker container inside of a dev container that's living out here in the cloud. Again, super nerdy. Not a ton of people are going to do some stuff like this, but the capabilities of having some of these things where you don't actually have to have all of it running on your box, and at least in a pinch, you could spin some of the stuff up, kind of fantastic.
Yeah, I think that kind of completes the what's possible and like the magic. So I think it's awesome.
Yep. Let's see if we go here. Nope. You know what? I'll reprovision this one and spin it up again real quick, and then we'll jump to another demo while we are waiting for this thing to reprovision. So another cool thing for folks to think about is just doing paired coding with somebody else, especially if you are looking at actually being able to do stuff straight off of GitHub. Let me provision new code space off of this one. This should spin up pretty quick. And this environment's just some Terraform code that I had. I think I did this for an old presentation to the Chicago PowerShell user group around doing Terraform for provisioning stuff in Azure. But through this environment, I have no dev container that's out here, right? This repo is essentially just a bunch of PowerShell scripts and my Terraform config files themselves, mostly for reminding myself how to actually go through and do the demo presentation itself. In this Codespace environment, it will just spin up an environment that will clone down this repository for me automatically. And I can look, and inside of this Codespace, I can tell it I want to install LiveShare. And installing LiveShare into this environment, and then telling it that I want to do a LiveShare, it'll give me the option to start a collab session. Let's open this in my browser. Let's tell it it can use my clipboard. Okay, so link is copied to the clipboard. Let me get to the chat so I can drop this inside of here. And anybody that wants to can go look at the live share off of this session, right? What will look like is once somebody decides to come in and do that, anybody that comes in and opens one of these files, including, let me just spin up another incognito browser on Firefox. Once this thing loads up, it takes a minute to actually go connect to GitHub to actually try and pull down the repository to see that it's a live sharing, and basically ask the host to admit somebody, and then ask if you want to do read only or if you want to do read write. Here, let's use MVP. You know what? We'll just do read write for everybody. Stephen Judd, read only. I trust you. But we can see, like, when folks are looking inside of the files inside of here or in this live share, I can actively go click on what individual people are looking at, right? And see what it is people are doing on here, or follow a specific person to actually see, who's working on which lines. This is pretty awesome. Waiting for this thing to come up on this box for me. Yeah, well. Anyways, we got enough of you guys on here to be able to show what's going on. But okay, if everybody wants to grab a screenshot, this is that workstation library, or sorry, that workshop library, documentation on dev containers, and a couple of really good links on where to go to get started and do some quick starts and some follow throughs on these things. I highly also recommend everybody go look for Polyglot notebooks. Number one, go back and look at the session that was done at PowerShell Summit 2023 that Michael Seidel did. That was where I first learned on Polyglot notebooks, and thinking of using that as a tool where basically you can give somebody a run book to go learn inside of your environment, but you have restricted permissions. They have specific code they can run, and they just can't run rampant. Fantastically awesome. If you don't want them to actually run live code, but just see what it looks like and see what the end result looks like as well, it'll save previous runs of the code. So just another tool for learning or for CYA inside of your environments. And then again, thanks for listening to me. I'm glad I was able to sit here and ramble for as long as I was. Make a connection with people, do things, share them. You can find me on Twitter. You can see my email address here. We've also got an open Discord community that's kind of started out of the VMware user group and spanned into lots of other folks. So I'm pretty easy to find online, and appreciate y'all listening to me ramble.
Great job, Joe. I think that was actually Mike Sewell's, right? Aren't you on here, Mike?
Yeah. Mike Sewell. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Hey, we'd like to say thank you to Joe Houghes for doing the presentation tonight. Joe, awesome job. Love the demos. Lots of really great information. If you'd like to see more on this, you could follow Joe online, look at his other presentations, and don't forget to check out the YouTube channel for lots of other PowerShell content. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.